Welcome, dear friend, to History After Midnight. I am so glad you are here. Wherever you are right now, whether you are stretched out beneath a soft blanket in a quiet bedroom somewhere in the American Midwest, or curled up with the low hum of a city outside your window on the East Coast, or maybe resting beneath the wide open sky of the Southwest where the night feels older and deeper than anywhere else on Earth, wherever you have landed tonight, you are exactly where you need to be. This channel exists for you and for moments exactly like this one. The lights are low, the world outside has gone quiet, and we are going to take a long, slow journey together into one of the oldest stories ever told by human beings. But before we go any further, I want to pause for just a moment and ask you something gentle, something easy, something that costs you nothing but a few seconds of quiet thought. If you feel moved to, drop a comment somewhere below this recording and tell me, which historical era do you find most peaceful when you think about it? Maybe it is ancient Greece, with its warm stone and olive trees and the slow sound of the Aegean Sea. Maybe it is medieval Japan with its candlelit temples and the smell of pine resin in the mountain air. Or maybe it is something closer to home, the early American frontier, or the quiet farms of colonial New England. There is no right answer. Any answer is welcome here. And if you do not feel like typing anything, that is perfectly fine too. You can simply tell me from wherever you are lying right now where in the world you are resting tonight. I love hearing that. I love knowing that someone in Texas is drifting off to this, or someone in Oregon, or someone who has traveled far from home and is listening in a hotel room in a strange city. You are all welcome here, every single one of you. Now, let us settle in. Let us breathe slowly. Let us let the evening do what evenings are meant to do. If you have a pillow you can pull a little closer, pull it closer now. If there is a blanket within reach, let it settle over you more fully. There is nowhere you need to be right now. Nothing you need to solve or answer or prepare for. The only thing being asked of you tonight is to listen, to let the words come in slowly, like water finding its level. To follow the sound of this voice the way a person follows a path through a familiar wood at dusk, not because they need to get somewhere urgently, but because the walking itself is good, and the light in the trees is worth paying attention to, and the evening is long and kind, and there is no hurry anywhere. I have always believed that stories do something that nothing else quite does. They give us a way to be in more than one time at once. To be here, in our bed, in our house, in our ordinary and specific life, and also to be somewhere else, somewhere ancient and enormous and full of wind and salt water, and the kind of beauty that comes from a world that does not know it is being watched. History is full of those places, full of ordinary people who had fires and worried about their children and smelled bread baking and looked up at the same stars we look at now. 3,000 years is a long time by human measure, but the stars over the Aegean Sea tonight look almost exactly as they did when a man named Odysseus sat on a pile of timbers on a dark beach and looked up at them and tried to figure out which way was home. Let that image sit with you for just a moment. A man on a beach. The fire is low. The smell of salt water and wood smoke is in the air. The stars are very bright in a sky that has no artificial light anywhere, not a single electric glow anywhere on the horizon, just the pure blaze of stars on a clear Mediterranean night, the way they must have looked before the world filled up with our own light. And the man is looking up at the stars the way people look at something they need and are not sure they deserve, with a hunger that is not quite hope and not quite despair, but something that sits between them and refuses to become either one. That man is who we are going to follow tonight. Tonight, we are going back almost 3,000 years. We are going back to a world that smelled of salt water and fire and olive oil. A world where the gods were not distant or metaphorical. They were felt in every gust of wind, every sudden storm at sea, every narrow escape from death. We are going to follow one man through 10 years of wandering, 10 years of longing for home, 10 years of being blown off course, tested beyond any reasonable limit, and somehow, despite everything, finding the thread that led him back to the people who loved him and waited for him and refused to stop believing he was still alive out there somewhere on the water. That man's name is Odysseus, and his story, which the ancient Greeks called the Odyssey, attributed to the poet Homer, is not just a story about war or adventure or monsters, though it has all of those things in it. It is, at its deepest level, a story about home. About the particular ache of longing for a place you love when you are not sure you will ever see it again. About the strange cruelty of time and the way it moves differently for the person who is far away than it does for the people left behind. About what it means to stay loyal to something, a wife, a son, a dog, a patch of rocky ground on a small island, when every force in the universe seems determined to push you away from it. Before we leave this beach and get the ships underway, let me tell you a little more about what this man was sailing back to, because the what matters as much as the who. Understanding what Odysseus was trying to get back to is the only way to understand why the journey went the way it did, why he refused so many comfortable alternatives along the way, why even the offer of immortality was not enough to make him stop. Odysseus was king of a small island called Ithaca. If you look at a map of Greece today, Ithaca is still there, a small green island off the northwestern coast, sitting just above the bottom lip of what we now call the Ionian Sea. It was not a grand or powerful kingdom by any measure. The ancient Greeks themselves described it as rocky and difficult to farm. The soil was thin. The island was not especially large. There were grander islands and richer kingdoms nearby, kingdoms with flatter land and deeper soil and easier harbors. Ithaca was the kind of place that required a person to love it specifically and personally, not because it was objectively superior to anywhere else, but because it was theirs. Because they knew exactly where the ground was softer in the shade of a particular hillside, and where the goats liked to shelter from the wind, and where the spring ran clearest, and which path through the scrub oak smelled a certain way after rain. That specific, particular knowledge of a place, the knowledge that only comes from years of living in it and paying attention, is a kind of wealth that does not appear on any inventory of a kingdom, but is real and valuable and, when it is taken from you, genuinely painful to do without. Odysseus carried that knowledge of Ithaca with him across every sea and every strange shore, and it was like a compass that always pointed in the same direction regardless of where he was or what the world was showing him. But it was his. And when he left it, as we are about to discover, the leaving cost him everything. It cost him 10 years of a war in Troy, which is a whole separate story, and then it cost him another 10 years of trying to find his way back across a sea that seemed, at times, to be actively alive and hostile and unwilling to let him go. Let us start at the very beginning, not at the beginning of the Trojan War itself. That would take another night, or several, but at the moment when the war has finally ended. When the great city of Troy has fallen at last, after 10 years of siege and battle and grief on both sides. The walls have been breached. The famous wooden horse, hollow and enormous, which the Greeks had left as a supposed gift outside the gates of Troy, had done its quiet, terrible work in the dark of a single night. The soldiers hidden inside it had slipped out while Troy slept, had opened the gates from within, and the Greek army had poured in. By morning, Troy was burning. So that is where we pick up, the morning after. The smoke is still rising from the ruins of a city that had stood for centuries. The Greek soldiers are scattered across the beach, loading their ships with what they have taken. The wind coming off the Aegean is cool and carries the smell of ash and salt together, which is not an entirely unpleasant smell if you are not thinking too hard about where the ash came from. The ships are beautiful in the early morning light, long, narrow wooden vessels, the hulls dark with pitch, the painted eyes on the prow staring forward at the horizon. The oars are shipped. The sails are not yet raised. The men are tired in a way that goes all the way down to their bones, the kind of tired that comes from 10 years of fighting in a foreign land far from everything you love. And Odysseus is among them. He is not the tallest man on that beach, and he is not the most physically imposing. He was often described as shorter than the other great heroes, shorter than Ajax, shorter than Achilles. But there was something in his face, some quality of intelligence and watchfulness that set him apart in any room or any gathering. His eyes moved differently than other men's eyes. He noticed things. He thought before he spoke when other men were already shouting. The ancient sources gave him several consistent qualities, and they come up again and again in the way Homer writes him. He was clever in a way that sometimes seemed more like cunning. He was persuasive. He was careful. He could be ruthless when he needed to be, and tender when tenderness was called for. He was, in the phrase the Greek poets used over and over, polytropos, a word that roughly means many-turned, or a man of many ways, a man who could shift and adapt. It is the very first word used to describe him in the Odyssey, and it tells you everything you need to know about who this man was. Think about that description for a moment, a man of many ways. In the ancient world, that was a complicated compliment, if it was a compliment at all. The Greeks had a deep respect for straightforwardness, for the man who said what he meant and did what he said, who was consistent and predictable, and whose word meant something because it always meant the same thing. Odysseus was not quite that man. He could be that man when it suited him, and he was better at it than most. But he was also a man who could put on a different face when a different face was needed, who could swallow his pride or his grief and present something else to the world while he worked out what to do next. The ancient Greeks admired this in him even as it made them slightly uneasy. He was not like Achilles, who was the great hero of pure feeling, who did exactly what he felt like doing at all times and was magnificent and terrifying and not quite survivable to be near. Odysseus was the man you wanted at the table when things went wrong. He thought in the dark. He planned. He took the long view when other men were looking only at what was directly in front of them. He was also, in this moment, standing on a beach with a broken army and a very long way to go to get home. The other Greek kings were making their plans. Some of them would have relatively straightforward journeys back, though the gods were not in a generous mood that day, and even the ones who made it home quickly did not all find what they were hoping for. The most famous of the not-so-lucky ones was Agamemnon, the great king who had led the entire Greek expedition. He made it home to Mycenae in good time, only to be murdered in his own bath by his wife and her lover. But that is his story, not ours. Odysseus gathered his 12 ships and his men, somewhere between 500 and 700 soldiers, roughly, depending on which ancient source you are reading, and they began to make their way westward. Ithaca was west and a little north of Troy, across the Aegean, then south and around the tip of Greece, and then a little more north again. It was not a simple journey, even in the best of conditions, and the conditions were not going to be good. There are two things you need to understand about why the journey of Odysseus became so catastrophic when so many other Greek ships made it home without incident. The first is practical. The Aegean and the Mediterranean are genuinely dangerous seas, especially for wooden ships with no engines and no GPS. where a sudden storm can end everything within a few hours. Sailors in the ancient world understood this in their bones. The sea was not predictable. The sea was something you treated with enormous respect, because it could kill you without warning and without apology. The second thing you need to understand is theological, in the ancient Greek sense of the word. Odysseus had made enemies among the gods, specifically among Poseidon, who was the god of the sea. The reason for Poseidon's anger is something we will get to, because it does not happen until fairly early in the journey. But the anger, once it was established, was enormous and lasting, and a god's anger in the ancient Greek world was not a metaphor. It was a force. It showed up in the weather and in the currents, and in the simple bad luck that can accumulate around a man until it seems less like coincidence and more like intention. But there was also a goddess on Odysseus' side, Athena, the gray-eyed goddess of wisdom and strategy, who had always favored him, had a deep and protective affection for this particular man. The ancient poets sometimes made it sound almost like friendship, an unusual thing between a mortal and a god, but then Odysseus was an unusual mortal. Athena and Poseidon were essentially at war over this one man's fate for 10 years, which is why the journey was so long and so strange. Poseidon kept pushing him off course into storms and dangerous waters. Athena kept maneuvering him back toward the possibility of survival. The result was 10 years of exhausting back and forth on the sea. Now, let us begin to move through this journey slowly and carefully the way the story deserves to be told, not rushing, not skipping the quiet parts or the strange parts or the parts that seem too small to matter, because often those are the parts that matter most. The first stop after leaving Troy was a place called Ismarus. This was the city of a people called the Cicons, and it was on the coast of Thrace, in the northern part of what is now northeastern Greece. Odysseus led his men in a raid on the city. This was fairly standard behavior for a Greek warrior returning from a war, and not something that the poem particularly condemns, though the consequences are immediate and severe. They took what they wanted from the city, and Odysseus wanted to leave immediately afterward, sensing that there would be a response. He was right to be worried, and his men did not listen. They stayed on the beach, drinking wine from the captured stores, eating meat, laughing in the way men laugh when they have survived something difficult and are not yet thinking clearly about what might still be coming. The next morning, the Cicons came back with reinforcements. They had sent word overnight to their neighbors inland, and by the time the sun was fully up, the beach was full of armed men who were not in a forgiving mood. The battle was bad. By the end of it, Odysseus had lost 6 men from each of his 12 ships, 72 men in a single morning, gone just like that. The rest scrambled back onto the ships and rowed hard away from the shore, and the waves and the wind took the grief that was sitting on all of them, and they sailed away from Ismarus feeling the weight of those losses in everything, in the silence between the oar strokes, in the way men did not quite meet each other's eyes. This loss matters. It is the first in a long series of losses, and the poem returns to it with an almost ritual quality. Each time Odysseus counts his men, each time he reckons the human cost of each adventure, there is that number in the background, 72 men gone before the real journey even began, before the gods had really started to interfere. Just because men stayed on a beach drinking wine too long, and the consequences of that small decision were permanent and could not be undone. They were 2 days out from Ismarus when a terrible storm hit them from the north. You have to picture what a storm on the open sea looks like from the deck of a small wooden ship, and these were not large ships, not by any modern measure. They were long and narrow and low to the water, designed for speed in good conditions, not for riding out heavy weather. In a bad storm, they were vulnerable in a way that a modern sailor, used to fiberglass hulls and engine power and weather radar, would find genuinely frightening. The sea came up underneath them and lifted them and set them down in the trough between waves, and the spray was horizontal and tasted of salt and stung the eyes to the point of blindness. And the sound of it all, the wind and the water and the groaning of the timber, was so loud that you had to grab a man's arm and pull him close to your face to speak to him and still not be sure he could hear you. The waves came up fast, taller than the mast, and the wind was the kind that tears words out of your mouth before you can finish forming them. The oars were useless. The sails were lowered and lashed down so they would not be shredded. The men held on to whatever was lashed to the hull and prayed to whatever god they thought might be listening, and the ships were driven south and east and then south again, spinning and pitching, for 2 full days before the storm finally exhausted itself. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes after a storm at sea, not just the physical tiredness of having held on for hours, but a deeper depletion, a feeling of having been subjected to something vast and indifferent that does not care whether you lived or died in it. When the sea finally flattened back into something manageable and the sky cleared and the sun came through, the men lay in the bottoms of the ships for a long time without moving or speaking, just breathing, just being glad of the silence. Odysseus looked around and had only a rough sense of where they were. They were much further south and west than they should have been. The storm had undone days of hard rowing and sailing, and they were now in waters that none of them knew particularly well. They came to land on the 3rd day after the storm, a low, green coastline, quiet, with a beach of pale sand and the smell of something sweet coming from the interior. This was the land of the lotus eaters. The name is simple and also precise. These were people who ate the fruit of the lotus plant, and the lotus fruit had a particular quality that you need to understand before anything else. It made you forget, not in a violent or sudden way, in a slow, warm, entirely pleasant way. If you ate the lotus, the longing went away, the grief went away. The memory of home, your wife, your children, the particular smell of your own house, the rough feel of your own door frame under your hand, all of that went away too, replaced by a mild contentment, a floating quietness, a soft blankness that was not unhappy but was not really alive either. Odysseus sent 3 men ahead to scout the coast and find out what kind of people lived there. Those 3 men made contact with the lotus eaters, who were not hostile. That is important to note. They were not dangerous in any obvious way. They offered the scouts some lotus fruit as a gesture of welcome, and the scouts ate it without thinking, the way you might accept a piece of fruit from a stranger without worrying too much about it. And then the grief left them, and the longing left them, and the memory of Ithaca and their families and everything they were supposed to be trying to get back to simply dissolved, gently, without drama, the way morning fog dissolves when the sun finally gets high enough. When they did not return, Odysseus went to find them himself. He found them sitting among the lotus eaters with the look of men who are very comfortable and have absolutely no intention of moving. When he tried to explain that they had to go, that the ships were waiting, that they had homes and people who needed them to come back, the 3 men wept. Not from sadness exactly, more from the frustration of being pulled back toward something they could no longer quite feel the importance of. They did not want to leave. They had no desire to return to a life that felt, under the influence of the lotus, like it belonged to someone else. Odysseus dragged them back to the ships himself. He had to physically pull them, weeping softly, back across the beach and over the gunwales and into the hulls of the ships, and then he ordered the oars out immediately and the ships away from that shore before anyone else could taste the lotus and forget what they were supposed to be doing. It is one of the first moments in the story where you see what kind of man Odysseus really was, not a man without compassion, but a man who understood that compassion sometimes means forcing someone back toward a life they have temporarily lost the will to live, because even when they do, not that the life is worth returning to. They rowed hard until the green shore of the Lotus Eaters was behind them and below the horizon, and then they stopped and ate their own meal and slept uneasily on their ships with the hollow sound of the water against the hull all around them, a sound that sailors learn to sleep through, but never entirely stop hearing. The next landfall was the one that would define the rest of the journey, the one that set Poseidon against Odysseus in a personal and permanent way. They came to an island that was wild and green and uninhabited, covered in the kind of dense vegetation that grows when nothing disturbs it for a long time, thick grasses, tall stands of trees, wild goats picking their way along the rocky hillsides. The goats were everywhere, which was good news for hungry sailors, and they killed several and cooked them on the beach and ate well for the first time in what felt like weeks. The wine they had taken from Ismarus was still mostly untouched, the good stuff kept in a sealed goatskin flask, and Odysseus had brought 12 amphorae of it, each one sealed with wax. From the island, they could see across a narrow channel of water to another shore, and on that shore, in the gathering dark of evening, they could see the orange glow of fires, and they could hear, drifting across the water, something enormous moving. They could hear voices, though voices is perhaps the wrong word, more like sounds that a voice would make if the person making them was very, very large. The sound was low and rough and occasional, the way a sound is when the thing making it is not trying to communicate with you, but simply exists, and its existence is loud. This was the land of the Cyclops. Now here I want you to very slowly for a moment, because this part of the story deserves some care. The Cyclops were giants, one eye set in the center of a very large forehead. They were said to be the sons of Poseidon, which is a significant detail that will matter very shortly. They did not farm or build or trade. They lived in caves and kept their sheep and goats, and were not, by any measure, friendly toward human beings. Each Cyclops lived alone in his own cave, without much interest in what the others were doing. They had no laws and no leaders and no particular interest in the opinions of anyone, including the gods. They were, in a word, wild. Completely and utterly wild in the ancient sense of the word. Outside civilization, outside the rules that governed how people were supposed to treat one another, outside the sacred Greek code of hospitality, which held that you were obligated to welcome a stranger at your door, feed them, house them, and only then ask who they were and where they were going. Odysseus decided to investigate. This was not, strictly speaking, a wise decision. His men could see from the island that whatever was over there was very large and possibly dangerous, and they said so. They said it clearly and with feeling. Odysseus went anyway, taking one ship and the best of his men, carrying the sealed flask of the very good wine as a kind of diplomatic gift, the way you bring a bottle of something nice when you visit someone's home for the first time. They crossed the channel and pulled the ship up onto a beach and walked inland until they found a large cave in the hillside. The cave was enormous. Even standing in the entrance, you could feel how big it was, the way you feel the scale of a large room before your eyes adjust, that first cool breath of larger air. Inside, there were pens made of stacked stones, and in the pens were lambs and kids, small and bleating quietly. There were large baskets of cheese hanging from the ceiling, each one as big as a barrel. There were buckets of whey enormous, set in rows along the cave wall. There were racks of drying meat. The place smelled of animals and cheese and smoke, and the stone floor was cold and damp and covered in a thick layer of what you would expect to find on the floor of a cave where sheep were kept. The Cyclops was not home. He was out with his flocks on the mountain. Odysseus's men looked around this cave and then looked at their captain and said, very reasonably, that they should take some of the cheese and some of the lambs and go back to the ship immediately. This was the sensible thing to do. This was, with hindsight, so clearly the right thing to do that the failure to do it becomes almost painful to read about. But Odysseus wanted to wait. He wanted to see what the Cyclops was like. He was curious. Curiosity is one of his defining qualities, and it serves him brilliantly throughout this story, and it also, in this moment, nearly destroys everyone. They waited. They made a fire of their own and ate some of the cheese and sat in the warm flicker of it, and then late in the evening they heard the Cyclops coming back. He came in through the cave entrance with an enormous load of wood on his back, which he dropped with a crash that shook the stone walls, and Odysseus's men pressed back against the far wall of the cave in the shadows, trying not to make any sound. The Cyclops brought his flocks inside, all of them, the ewes and the does he kept for milking, and then he rolled an enormous boulder across the entrance to the cave. A boulder, the poem says, that 20 wagons could not have moved. And then he lit his own fire, and by its light he saw the men crouched against the cave wall. He asked who they were. His voice was very large. Odysseus stepped forward and spoke carefully and respectfully, identifying himself and his men as soldiers of Agamemnon on their way home from the Trojan War, and asking for the hospitality that the gods required, food and shelter and safe passage. He invoked Zeus, the king of the gods, who was understood to be the guardian of hospitality in particular. It was the correct appeal to make. It was the appeal that should have worked. The Cyclops said that he did not care about Zeus. The Cyclopes, he said, were stronger than the gods and had no need to fear them. And then he grabbed 2 of the men, just like that, reached across the cave floor with an enormous hand and picked up 2 men the way you might pick up a pair of apples, and killed them quickly and without ceremony, and ate them, and then lay down and went to sleep by the dying fire. What follows in the cave over the next 2 days is one of the more extraordinary displays of thinking under pressure in all of ancient literature. Odysseus had a sword at his side. He could have killed the Cyclops as he slept. He reached for the sword, in fact. And then he stopped, because he had thought it through and seen the problem, the boulder at the entrance. None of them could move it. If the Cyclops died, they would be sealed inside the cave forever. So he put the sword away and he thought. In the morning, the Cyclops ate 2 more men and went out with his flocks. He rolled the boulder back across the entrance, and the survivors were left in the dark, and Odysseus sat with his grief and his anger. 2 more of his men, 2 more of the people he was responsible for bringing home, and he made a plan. He found a large wooden stake that the Cyclops had left in the cave, cut from a green olive tree, as big as the mast of a ship. He sharpened one end of it to a point and hardened the point in the coals of the fire, and then he hid it under a pile of dung, and he waited. That evening the Cyclops came back and ate 2 more men, and then Odysseus offered him a bowl of the wine he had brought. The wine was extraordinary. The ancient poet makes a point of saying it was very strong stuff, the kind you were supposed to dilute with 20 parts water before drinking. The Cyclops drank it neat, from a bowl the size of a small bathtub, and it hit him immediately, and he asked for more, and Odysseus gave him more, and when the Cyclops asked his guest's name, Odysseus said, "Nobody. My name is Nobody." And the Cyclops laughed and said that his gift to nobody would be that he would eat nobody last, and that was the only kindness he had in him. And then he lay down among his sheep and went to sleep with the sound of a very large creature who has drunk a great deal of very strong wine, which is to say he was unconscious almost immediately, and the snoring of him filled the cave like a second presence. Odysseus heated the sharpened stake in the coals of the fire until the tip was glowing, and then he and 4 of his men drove it into the Cyclops' single eye. The description of this in the poem is startling and precise, and I will not dwell on it here, but the result was that the Cyclops was blinded, and he screamed in the dark cave, a sound that must have been enormous, a sound that would have rolled across the water and into the night and maybe woken people on distant shores, and other Cyclopes came to the entrance of the cave and called out, asking what was wrong, asking if anyone was hurting him, and the blinded Cyclops screamed back, "Nobody is hurting me. Nobody is killing me." And the other Cyclopes, who had no patience for a neighbor shouting riddles in the middle of the night, grumbled and went back to their own caves, and Odysseus pressed himself against the cave wall in the dark and felt, for just a moment, the extraordinary pleasure of a plan working exactly as intended. The Cyclops moved the boulder aside in the morning to let his sheep out to pasture, standing in the entrance with his arms spread wide to catch any man who might try to slip past him. Odysseus tied his men underneath the sheep, 1 man to each animal, hidden in the dense warm wool of the animals' bellies, and he himself held on underneath the largest ram, the lead animal of the flock. 1 by 1 the sheep went out past the blinded, groping Cyclops, and 1 by 1 the men slipped free and ran for the beach. Odysseus, beneath the large ram, went last. The Cyclops stopped the ram at the entrance. It was unusual for the ram to be last, he said, and he spoke to it in a way that was almost gentle, the big hand moving over the animal's back just inches above the man hidden beneath. He told the ram that he wished the ram could speak, so it could tell him where nobody was hiding, and then the ram walked on and Odysseus was outside and running. They made it to the ship and pushed off, and Odysseus made the first mistake of the escape. He called back to the Cyclops, letting him know that he had been outsmarted, that it was Odysseus of Ithaca who had blinded him. His men begged him not to. They could see the Cyclops on the beach, pulling boulders from the cliff top and hurling them in the direction of the voice, and the waves from where the boulders landed pushed the ship back toward shore rather than away from it. But Odysseus called out his name again, Odysseus, son of Charybdis from Ithaca, and it was pride that made him do it, or something beyond pride, some need to be known to have the story be told correctly, to have the monster know who had beaten him. And the Cyclops, whose name was Polyphemus, stretched his arms toward the sky and prayed to his father. His father, as I mentioned before, was Poseidon. He prayed that Odysseus of Ithaca would never reach home, or if the fates required that he reach home, that he arrive late and miserable on a stranger's ship with all his men lost, and find nothing but trouble waiting for him. And Poseidon heard him. That is the defining, terrible moment that sets everything in motion from here. A god's son had been blinded, and the god heard the prayer of his son, and from that point forward Odysseus was sailing on an ocean whose ruler actively wanted him to fail. The fleet reassembled at the small island where they had first sheltered, and they divided the sheep they had taken from the Cyclops' cave and sacrificed the great ram to Zeus. And Odysseus held the feast but did not eat. He sat apart, still feeling the weight of the men he had lost in that cave. 6 from each ship at Ismarus, 6 in the cave of the Cyclops. The numbers were accumulating. The surviving men could feel the change in their captain, the way a good crew always feels a shift in the person responsible for them, and they ate and drank more quietly than they might have otherwise, and by evening they had all fallen asleep on the beach with the fire burning low. They sailed on. The next important landfall was the island of Aeolus, and here, for the first time, something genuinely hopeful happened, though the hope lasted only a short time. Aeolus was the keeper of the winds. He lived on a floating island. The poem describes it as literally floating, held up on brass walls, in a cliff-ringed sea, with his 12 children, 6 sons and 6 daughters who were married to each other, all living happily together. It was an unusual household, but apparently a harmonious one, and Aeolus was warm and generous to his guest. He hosted Odysseus for an entire month, feeding him and letting him rest and listening eagerly to the stories of the Trojan War, which was the news of the age, and everyone wanted to know everything about it. When it was time for Odysseus and his men to leave, Aeolus gave him a remarkable gift. He took the skin of a great ox, and into it he sewed every troublesome wind, every contrary gust and crossing wind and storm-making wind, and he tied the mouth of the sack with a silver cord and gave it to Odysseus and told him to keep it in the hold of the ship, not to open it, and that as long as it stayed sealed, only the west wind would blow, and the west wind would carry them straight home to Ithaca. It was, in effect, a gift of guaranteed safe passage. It was almost too good to be true, and it was. They sailed for 9 days. 9 days with a steady western wind behind them, the ships moving well, the men rested and fed and in better spirits than they had been at any point since leaving Troy. Odysseus stayed awake at the steering oar for all 9 days, not trusting anyone else with the task, not willing to sleep when they were so close. On the 10th day, as the low hills of Ithaca finally appeared on the horizon, as Odysseus could actually see the smoke rising from the hearth fires of his own island, exhaustion finally took him. He fell asleep at the stern, the oxskin bag still sitting in the hold beneath the ship's timbers. His men had been watching that bag for 9 days. They had seen Aeolus hand it over, but they did not know what was in it, and they had been talking among themselves about the possibilities. The most popular theory, which they had been quietly building on throughout the voyage, was that the bag contained gold and silver, treasure that Aeolus had given to Odysseus personally, which Odysseus was planning to keep for himself while they got nothing. This was not true. But it felt true, the way rumors feel true when you have been at sea for a long time with too much thinking and too little sleep. And when their captain finally fell asleep for the first time in 9 days, they opened the bag. Every wind inside rushed out at once. The resulting storm was immediate and absolute. It hit the sleeping man in the stern like a slap, and he woke to the worst sound a sailor can wake to, the sound of all the sails catching air wrong at the same time, the creak and crack of ropes under impossible strain, the boom of sudden waves. In moments they could no longer see Ithaca at all. The wind swept them east and then north and then east again, fast and hard, and Ithaca fell below the horizon, and then they were back at the floating island of Aeolus, driven all the way back to the very beginning of those 9 days of travel in the space of what felt like hours. Odysseus went to Aeolus and explained what had happened and asked for help again. Aeolus refused. He said, with a sadness that is almost audible in the ancient text, that he could not help a man whom the gods so clearly wanted to be lost. That was not something a human being, even a divine-favored one, could argue with or overcome. And so Odysseus went back to his ships and his men, who were struggling to look him in the eye, and they rowed in silence away from the floating island and back into the open sea. What followed was 6 days of very hard rowing with no wind at all. The men rowed without stopping, in shifts, until their hands were raw and their backs ached with a deep, grinding pain that no amount of stretching could relieve. They came to the land of the Laestrygonians, a people so large that the first scout who encountered one of them described the woman he met at the well as being the size of a small mountain, and was then taken to meet the woman's husband, who was even larger, and who immediately ate the scout and had the alarm raised to bring the rest of his people down to the harbor where the Greek ships were moored. The harbor, unfortunately, was surrounded by high cliffs on three sides, with only a narrow entrance to the sea, exactly the kind of harbor that any sailor would be happy to find on a coastline, because it offered such shelter from the wind and waves, and exactly the kind of harbor that becomes a death trap if the surrounding cliffs are occupied by very large people who are throwing enormous rocks down onto your ships. Odysseus's ship was the only one he had moored at the entrance, outside the harbor proper, which was the only reason it survived. Every other ship, 11 ships, hundreds of men, was sunk by boulders from the cliff tops or pulled under by the Laestrygonians, who waded into the shallows and dragged the crews out of the water. Odysseus cut his mooring rope with a sword and shouted at his men to row, and they rowed, and they did not look back at what was happening behind them. When they finally found a quiet cove and pulled the ship up onto the sand, Odysseus sat in the stern and did not speak for a long time. He wept. The men sat around him and wept, and nobody said anything, because there was nothing to say. They had come to this shore with 12 ships. They now had one. The numbers were unthinkable. There was no word for what they had lost on those cliffs. Not yet. Grief has a way of arriving slowly when the loss is too large, working its way in through small gaps in the armor of shock before the full weight of it settles. They stayed in the cove for 2 days, too exhausted and too emptied out to do anything else. And then, on the third day, Odysseus climbed to the high ground above the cove and looked out across the island they had landed on. He could see, across a deep wood, a thin column of smoke rising. Something lived over there. Somewhere in those trees, there was fire, which meant there was a habitation, which meant there was someone they could ask for help, or from whom they could take food, or at least from whom they could learn where they were. He divided the surviving men into 2 groups, his own and one led by a man named Eurylochus, and Eurylochus's group went toward the smoke. They found a house of polished stone in a clearing in the woods, surrounded by wolves and lions who padded around the house in the sunlight as though they were domestic animals, which was unnerving until the men realized that the wolves and lions were not threatening them. The animals were calm. They were wagging their tails. In fact, the lions and the wolves, both of them, with their tails moving slowly back and forth, which is not typical wolf or lion behavior and which should have been the first sign that something unusual was happening. From inside the house came a woman's voice, singing. The voice was beautiful in the way that very few things are beautiful, beautiful in a way that goes all the way through you, that does not leave any space for doubt or analysis, that simply takes hold of you and moves you forward. Most of the men walked toward the door. Eurylochus stayed outside. His instincts told him something was wrong, and his instincts were correct, and staying outside was the decision that kept him alive. The woman who opened the door was named Circe. She was divine or semi-divine, a witch, a goddess of sorts, or a sorceress, depending on the text you are reading. She was beautiful in the same way her voice was beautiful, completely, without reserve. She welcomed the men in and sat them down and gave them food and wine, and the men ate and drank because they were hungry and exhausted, and because it had been so long since anyone had been genuinely kind to them. And then Circe touched them each in turn with a long wand she kept, and they became pigs. Not metaphorically, actually. They were physically transformed, snouts, hooves, trotters, the whole thing, while their human mind stayed inside, which is somehow the worst part of the description. The men as pigs, herded into a pen, looking at each other with entirely human eyes full of confusion and grief. Eurylochus ran back to the ship and told Odysseus what had happened, and Odysseus went toward the house alone. On the way, he was met by a young man who turned out to be Hermes, the messenger god, who appeared to him in the form of someone his own age and stopped him on the path and told him what he was about to face and gave him a specific gift, a herb called moly, white-flowered and black-rooted, which would protect him against Circe's magic. And Hermes told him exactly what to do. Let Circe feed him, and then, when she touched him with the wand and nothing happened, draw his sword and advance on her as though he meant to kill her, and she would ask him to stop and make an offer. It happened almost exactly as Hermes described. Circe was surprised and perhaps impressed, though the emotion on a sorceress's face is difficult to read when the wand had no effect. She recognized almost immediately that he must have eaten the moly, and she recognized that the moly could only have come from Hermes, and she recognized, therefore, that this particular visitor was someone significantly above the ordinary. She made her offer, which was peace. Odysseus made his counteroffer, which was the restoration of his men. She agreed. The pigs in the pen were given a different touch of the wand, and they became men again, and they were, the poem says, even handsomer and taller than they had been before. They stayed with Circe for a full year. Odysseus's men were well-fed, rested, clothed, bathed, treated with something like care. Circe's wolves and lions padded around them in the sunlight and did not bother anyone. The house was warm, the food was good, there was wine in abundance. And at some point, when the year was ending, it was the men who reminded Odysseus that they really ought to be trying to go home, and not Odysseus who reminded them. The island of Circe was a kind of soft trap, not cruel, not hostile, but comfortable enough to make you stop missing what you were supposed to be going back to. But before Circe would tell Odysseus the route home, she told him that he had to do something first. He had to go somewhere that no living man had gone before, the underworld, the land of the dead. He needed to speak to the spirit of a prophet named Tiresias, who was blind in life but could see things in death that the living could not know, and Tiresias could tell him what route to take and what to avoid and what the fates had written for the journey ahead. Circe gave him detailed instructions, where to sail, what rituals to perform to call the dead up to speak to him, and he followed them. The journey to the edge of the underworld is one of the quieter, stranger sections of the poem, and I want to move through it slowly because it deserves that care. They sailed north and west into waters that grow progressively more gray, not stormy, just gray, the light becoming somehow less direct, the sun sitting behind clouds that were not clouds exactly, but more like a permanent softening of the sky. They came to a shore where two rivers met, underground rivers that bubbled up from the earth and formed a swampy confluence at the edge of the world. The land beyond was shrouded in mist and darkness. The sound of the water was very soft. Everything there was very soft and very quiet, the kind of quiet that has a texture to it, like a room full of something you cannot quite name. Odysseus dug a pit at the confluence of the rivers, a cubit in each direction, and poured offerings into it, first honey and milk, then wine, then water, and then he sprinkled white barley over it all, and then he killed a black sheep and let the blood pour into the pit, because blood was the thing that called the dead up from the depths. They came immediately. The dead came up out of the earth in crowds, young men who had died in battle, old men, women, children, all of them gray and insubstantial as shadows, pressing toward the blood because blood was what let them speak and remember. Odysseus held them back with his sword, waiting for Tiresias. And while he waited, he saw faces he recognized. He saw Elpenor first, one of his own men who had died that very morning on Circe's island, fallen from the roof of the house while still drunk and half asleep, his neck broken in the fall. Elpenor had not yet been buried, and he asked Odysseus with great urgency not to leave his body unburied and unburned when he returned to Circe's island. Odysseus promised he would remember this. He saw his mother, Anticlea. She had been alive when he left for Troy, and he had not known she had died. She came up among the crowd of the dead, and he almost ran to her, the way you run to a parent you thought you would never see again. But he held her back with his sword, because he needed Tiresias to drink from the pit first, and the rules of the ritual were absolute. To hold back your own dead mother with a drawn sword while she drifts there on the other side of it, gray and insubstantial, is one of the more genuinely painful images in this entire story. Tiresias came eventually and drank and spoke clearly and precisely, the way prophets speak when they are being helpful rather than cryptic. He told Odysseus that Poseidon's anger would make the journey hard. He said that it was possible to reach Ithaca, but that everything depended on what happened when they came to the island of Thrinacia, where the cattle of the sun Helios grazed. He said that those cattle must not be touched, not a single one must be harmed, not a single one killed or eaten, and if that rule was kept, it was possible, though difficult, to reach home. If the cattle were harmed, the ship and all its crew would be destroyed. He said that when Odysseus reached Ithaca, he would find his house full of men who were eating his food and pressing his wife to choose one of them as a new husband, and that Odysseus would have to deal with them, and that it would not be simple or clean. And then Tiresias told him one more thing, which I will hold back for now because it belongs to the very end of the story. After Tiresias stepped back, Odysseus let his mother drink from the pit, and they spoke. She told him that she had died of grief, missing him, that the longing for him had worn away her life the way water wears away stone, slowly and without drama, until there was simply nothing left. She told him that his father Laertes lived on his small farm and did not come into the city anymore, just slept on the floor among the farm hands and let the grief sit on him like a coat he could not take off. She told him that Penelope, his wife, was still waiting, still faithful, still weeping at night, still refusing to give up. And when Odysseus tried 3 times to take her in his arms, 3 times she passed through his hands like smoke and shadow, because the dead have no substance and cannot be held, and that is perhaps the most direct and honest statement about death that any ancient poem has ever made. He spoke to others while he stood there at the edge of the world, to Agamemnon, who warned him not to trust women and told him how he had died, to Achilles, who asked about his son, to Ajax, who still would not speak to him over an old argument. He saw the great sinners of mythology enduring their eternal punishments, Tantalus forever reaching for food and water that slipped just out of reach, Sisyphus endlessly rolling his boulder up a hill only to watch it roll back down. He watched them for a long time, these images of punishment and futility, and then the crowd of the dead pressed too close, and the sound of them, not loud, but many, the accumulated low noise of many quiet voices all speaking at once, became overwhelming, and he ran back to his ship and ordered the men to row. They came back to Circe's island and buried Elpenor as promised, as Elpenor had asked, and Circe met them again and gave Odysseus one last set of detailed warnings for the journey ahead. She described in order everything they were going to encounter and how to handle each one. The Sirens first, creatures who sang from an island and whose singing was so beautiful that any sailor who heard it would turn his ship toward it and sail straight into the rocks of the shore, which was full of the bones of ships and the crews of ships that had done exactly that. The only way to pass safely was not to hear the singing. Odysseus should put beeswax in his men's ears, stopping up the sound completely, and if Odysseus himself wanted to hear the singing, which Circe knew he would, because he was that kind of man, he should have himself tied to the mast before they reached the island, and his orders to his men should be to ignore anything he said while he could hear the sirens, no matter how loudly or urgently he commanded them. After the sirens, Circe said there were two routes, one past the wandering rocks, which smashed together and destroyed everything that passed between them, and which only the Argo and its divine crew had ever safely navigated, and one past two cliffs in a narrow channel where, on one side there, lived a monster called Scylla, and on the other a whirlpool called Charybdis. Scylla lived in a cave high on one cliff, above the reach of any weapon, and she had 12 legs and 6 heads, and each head had 3 rows of teeth, and each mouth reached down to grab whatever passed beneath. She would take 6 men, 1 for each head, and there was nothing anyone could do to prevent it. Charybdis, on the other side of the channel, was a whirlpool that sucked down everything in its range 3 times a day, and then belched it back up again. The trick, Circe said, was to sail close to Scylla's side and sacrifice the 6 men rather than risk the whole ship to Charybdis. Not to fight Scylla, there was no fighting Scylla, but to accept the loss of those 6 and keep the ship moving. And then the island of Thrinacia, with the cattle of Helios, which she reiterated with great emphasis. Do not touch them, under any circumstances. They set out the next morning with a following wine that Circe had arranged, which is a small and touching thing. Even when being helpful, she helped the way a powerful being helps, arranging the weather for the people she wanted well. And almost immediately, as the island of the Sirens appeared ahead of them in the bright morning, Odysseus did as he had been told. He stopped up every man's ears with wax, kneading it soft in his hands until it was warm and pliable, and pressed it carefully into place himself, moving from man to man. Then he stood at the mast and held out his hands and let them lash him to it, wrists bound, chest bound, feet bound, tight enough that he could not move. The island of the Sirens was low in the water and bright green above the white rock, and the Sirens themselves. The poem does not describe them in great physical detail, leaving them somewhat undefined, which is perhaps the right choice for a creature that operates entirely through sound, sat in a meadow of deep grass and began to sing as the ship approached. The singing was immediate in its effect on Odysseus. He described it later, and even his description is barely adequate to convey what it was like. It was not just beautiful. It promised everything. It promised that anyone who came to it would leave wiser, knowing all the things that had ever happened on the earth, knowing all the things that were happening and all the things that would happen. It was the voice of complete knowledge offered freely to anyone willing to come in and listen. He pulled at the ropes. He screamed at his men to untie him. He used every gesture he knew, nodding his head violently, widening his eyes, to try to communicate that he needed to be freed immediately. His men, who could hear nothing, did as they had been told. They rowed harder, and the 2 men assigned to watch him tightened the ropes rather than loosening them. They rowed past the island. The singing faded. The sound of the oars on the water came back. And when the island was well behind them and he could no longer hear anything at all, he nodded and they untied him. He stood at the stern for a while and looked back at the water where the singing had been and felt a particular loss of something extraordinary that you can never quite return to. Almost immediately they heard and then saw Charybdis. Even with the wax out of their ears now, Odysseus signaled for the men to remove it as they approached the narrows. The sound of it was below the range of hearing for a while before it became an actual sound. A deep vibration that sat in the chest, then a roar that got louder as they entered the channel between the cliffs. The whirlpool was on the right, a massive, churning depression in the water, surrounded by spray, the dark water at the center visible briefly before it sucked down and then boiled back up. They steered hard left, toward the cliffs on Scylla's side, and Odysseus stood in the bow with 2 spears, scanning the cliff face for the cave, trying to spot Scylla before she struck. He did not spot her. The ancient text is quite clear about this, and there is something almost deliberately unfair in the way it is described. You cannot fight Scylla. You cannot see her in time. Scylla simply reaches out from her high cave and takes what she is going to take, and the only mercy, if it is a mercy, is that it happens very fast. 6 men, 1 for each head, pulled off the deck without warning, carried up into the cave in the rock face. Their voices carried back down to the ship as they went up, calling out Odysseus' name, reaching for him with their hands, because even in that moment of sudden and absolute horror, the reflex was to reach for the person in charge, the person who was supposed to be keeping them safe. He watched them go up and there was nothing to do, and he said in the poem that of all the terrible things he saw in those 10 years, that was the worst. Those hands reaching down toward him as they were carried up, his men calling his name. The ship came through the Narrows. They were past Scylla and Charybdis, past the worst of it, and they were alive, most of them, and then ahead of them, low on the water in the afternoon light, was Thrinacia, the island of the cattle of the sun. Odysseus wanted to go straight past. He remembered what Tiresias had said and what Circe had said, and he recognized the danger of landing there with tired, hungry, grieving men. He said this to his men. He said they should sail through the night and not stop. Eurylochus, the same one who had stood outside Circe's house with enough sense to survive, pushed back. He said the men were exhausted. He said they could see the island and smell it, and there was a beach, and it would be cruel to push on without rest. He was not wrong that the men were exhausted. He was not wrong that they needed rest. He was simply catastrophically wrong about where they should take it. They landed. Odysseus made the men swear an oath, a formal, sacred oath, which in the ancient Greek world was not a small thing, that they would not touch the cattle of Helios, that no matter what happened they would eat what they had brought with them, and leave the herds alone. The men swore. They ate what they had and they slept. And then a storm came in and locked them on the island for a month. A solid month, with nowhere to go, the wind blowing hard and steady from the wrong direction, the ships unable to leave, the food they had brought running out. They ate fish and birds and whatever the island provided that was not the cattle. And the cattle were everywhere, enormous and beautiful, their coats gleaming, the sound of them moving through the grass a constant presence, a persistent temptation. A month is a very long time to be hungry next to something you have promised not to eat. Eurylochus broke first. He went to the other men while Odysseus was asleep, praying in a grove of trees some distance from the shore. He argued that any death was better than starvation, and that if the sun god was angry, they could build him a temple when they got home, make amends, put things right. And the men were hungry enough by then to hear this as reason rather than desperation. They killed some of the cattle and cooked them on the beach. When Odysseus came back and smelled the meat cooking, he knew immediately what had happened. He went to the shore and he looked at what they had done, and for a moment he simply stood there, because there was truly nothing to be said. He had extracted the oath from them. He had warned them. He had told them exactly what Tiresias had said would happen, and they had done it anyway, because hunger and desperation will eventually overcome most other considerations in a human being. And this was not a failing unique to them, it was simply human, which does not make it less catastrophic. The sun god Helios was already complaining to Zeus before they had finished eating. He said he wanted revenge or he would take his light down to the underworld, which was a significant threat. The god of the sun threatening to stop shining is not an argument anyone wants to have. Zeus promised that justice would be served, and the mechanism of that justice was ready and waiting. They still had to get off the island. The storm broke after one more day. The ships put out. The wind was calm, then brisk, then the sky began to darken in the west with a speed that had nothing natural about it, and a squall of lightning and black wind came out of the west and hit the ship so hard that everything on deck that was not lashed down went into the sea, including several men. The mast snapped, the keel cracked, the ship broke apart on the water the way a ship breaks when it is struck by something that wants it to break. And all of them, Eurylochus, every man who had eaten the cattle, were gone into the water and were not there anymore. The sea took them all and did not give them back. Odysseus lashed the keel to the broken mast and held on. That is all there was to do. He floated on the wreckage of his ship, alone, in the dark, on an ocean whose god wanted him dead. The wreckage drifted south during the night, and the next day, blown by the same west wind that had destroyed the ship, and by evening it had carried him back to the Narrows, back to Charybdis. The whirlpool sucked down the mast and the keel, and Odysseus leaped and grabbed the branch of a fig tree that grew from the rock face above the whirlpool, and he hung there, over the dark water, for hours, until the whirlpool belched back up the timbers, and he dropped back down to them and paddled away with his hands for 9 days, until the island of Ogygia appeared on the horizon. Ogygia was the home of Calypso, a goddess or a nymph. The distinction matters less than the effect. She lived alone on an island that was, by every description, extraordinarily beautiful. The trees were thick and tall and full of birds. The cave where she lived was walled in ivy and grapevines, and a spring ran clear beside it, and 4 rivers ran in different directions from it through meadows full of wild celery and violets. It smelled of cedar wood and burning cypress. It was, in any reasonable understanding, a paradise. And Odysseus, arriving on it half-drowned, alone with every man he had ever led now dead, stayed there for 7 years. Calypso loved him. That is not in dispute in the poem. She loved him sincerely, and she treated him well, and she offered him something extraordinary, immortality. She told him that if he stayed with her, he would never die, never age, never have to face the grief and the loss and the grinding physical difficulty of being a mortal man in a mortal world. She told him this not as manipulation, but as a genuine offer. She wanted him to stay. She would have made him happy, or at least permanently comfortable, which is perhaps the closest thing to happiness that anyone can guarantee. Take a moment with that offer, immortality. Never aging, never dying, never losing anyone you love to time, never having the specific fear that haunts the back of a mortal person's mind at 3 in the morning, the knowledge that the body is temporary, that the light goes out eventually, that everything ends. To have that fear simply removed permanently by a goddess who also happened to live in one of the most beautiful places in the world and who genuinely cared about the person she was offering it to. That is not a small thing to turn down. That is, by most reasonable calculations, the most extraordinary offer any human being in the history of the world has ever received and refused. And he refused it, not coldly or easily. The poem is honest about the fact that the arrangement was not entirely without its comforts, that 7 years a long time, and that certain adjustments to circumstances are inevitable when circumstances are what they are. But the soul of him was not on Ogygia. The soul of him was always on that western cliff looking at the water. Every morning when the light came clear and beautiful through the cedar trees and the birds started and the spring ran cold and sweet beside the cave, he woke and knew where he was and knew it was not where he was supposed to be. 7 years of that. 7 years of beautiful imprisonment in a beautiful place, which is not a comfortable thing to carry regardless of how beautiful the prison is, and which becomes, over enough time, its own form of grief. He refused. Every day, on the island of Ogygia, Odysseus walked to the western shore and sat on the rocks and looked out over the water toward where Ithaca was, and he wept. He wept in the specific way that people weep when they are not sure if they have the right to the thing they are grieving, not dramatically, not loudly, just quietly and steadily, the way water runs over stone. Calypso could see it and could not change it. She tried sometimes to comfort him or distract him, and he was not unkind about any of it. He was kind to her and grateful and lived in her cave for 7 years, but he was not there. He was always somewhere else, some western point on the water, looking toward home. The heart goes where it goes, not always where it makes the most logical sense to go, not always toward the easiest or safest or most comfortable place, just home, whatever home means for the person doing the longing. For Odysseus it meant Ithaca, and it meant Penelope, and it meant the particular quality of an Ithacan morning, and those things could not be replaced by paradise. It was Athena who finally intervened. There is a council of the gods at the beginning of the Odyssey. The actual written poem opens here, then tells the earlier story in retrospect, where Athena petitions Zeus on Odysseus' behalf. She points out that he has been on Calypso's island for 7 years, and that he has done nothing to deserve this, that he is a good man who honored the gods and kept his promises, and that something should be done. Zeus agrees. He sends Hermes to Calypso's island with a message. She has to let him go. Calypso's response to the message from Hermes is one of the most quietly dignified moments in the poem. She is angry, furious, actually in the way that only a being who has had something taken from them can be furious, but she does not argue with Zeus. She does not refuse. She says what she thinks, clearly and with some bitterness, about the double standard by which male gods take mortal lovers and are never interfered with, while female goddesses are always eventually forced to give up the men they love. And then she goes to Odysseus and tells him he is free to go. She helps him build a raft with her own hands, showing him which trees to cut and how to lash the timbers, giving him provisions, giving him a good wind. The raft voyage was 17 days of open ocean, which should give you some sense of how far from the rest of the world Ogygia was. 17 days. Odysseus navigated by the stars at night. Calypso had told him to keep the Great Bear on his left, which would take him east, and by the sun during the day. He did not sleep much. He kept the raft pointed true. On the 18th day he could see, on the horizon ahead, the shadow of land, the island of Scheria, where the Phaeacians lived. His heart lifted. Poseidon saw him. The god was returning from a feast he had been attending elsewhere, and glanced down at the water and saw his enemy, nearly home, and was not going to let it end like this. He raised a storm with his trident, striking the water, and the sea went from calm to catastrophic in a matter of moments. The raft was swamped and then hit by a wave that threw Odysseus off it and into the water, and he was under the water for what felt like a very long time before he came up gasping. He got back to the raft, but it was breaking apart. A sea goddess named Ino appeared in the form of a gull and gave him a miraculous veil and told him to strip off the waterlogged clothes, tie the veil around his waist, and swim. She said it would keep him from drowning. He looked at the raft, breaking up around him, and the veil in his hand, and he made the decision to trust her, which was not a small act of faith, given how the divine beings in his experience had behaved so far, and he stripped and swam. He swam for 2 days and 2 nights. The coast of Scheria was visible, but the waves kept pushing him past the mouths of rivers that might have offered shelter, drove him toward rock cliffs that would have killed him. His hands and knees were cut by the rocks. He finally got a grip on a submerged rock and held on against the current until a wave dragged him back off it, and then another wave drove him into the mouth of a calm river inlet, and the current ceased, and he waded out onto the bank and collapsed on the ground in the reed beds. He slept. He slept in the reeds, covered in leaves he piled over himself for warmth, and he slept the way a man sleeps who has not truly rested in days, which is deeply and completely and without dreaming, or if dreaming, then the dreams did not stay with him when he woke, because the body's need for sleep was greater than the mind's need to process anything. In the morning, the Phaeacian princess Nausicaa came to the river to do laundry. She had come with her handmaidens, and they worked and washed and played a ball game afterward in the meadow, throwing the ball back and forth, their voices high and clear in the morning air. The ball went into the river at one point, and the resulting shout woke Odysseus from his sleep in the reeds. He got up, covering himself with a branch. He had no clothes, remember, having taken them off in the sea, and came out of the reeds to ask for help. The moment when a naked, saltwater-battered, reed-covered man steps out of a riverbed to approach a princess and her ladies is one of the more delicately managed scenes in the poem, and Homer's handling of it is remarkable. The handmaidens scatter immediately. Nausicaa stands her ground, which says everything about her character. Odysseus speaks to her carefully and beautifully, telling her she must be either a goddess or a king's daughter, and that either way she is the most remarkable thing he has seen since he left home, and he asks for a piece of cloth to cover himself and for directions to the city. He is charming without being inappropriate, deferential without being servile. She gives him clothes and food and tells her handmaidens to take him to the river and let him wash, and then bring him along to the city, which she herself will reach first, because it would look unusual for a princess to ride into town with a stranger in tow. The Phaeacians were a remarkable people. They were great sailors, the best sailors in the world, in fact, with ships that were said to need no steering, that found their own way to any destination as though by instinct. They were prosperous and comfortable, and they lived at the edge of the known world, close enough to the gods to receive divine visitors without too much disruption to the daily routine. Their king was Alcinous, and his wife was a wit who was sharp and perceptive and whose opinion was the one that mattered most in that household. Odysseus came to the palace, which was magnificent, the poem's description of it almost breathless with adjectives: bronze walls and gold doors and silver doorposts, dogs made of gold flanking the entrance, which were the work of the god Hephaestus, and were immortal and did not age, and he made his entrance by going to Rete first, taking her hands and asking for help getting home. It was Athena who told him to approach Rete first, and it was the right call, because within moments Alcinous had promised his guest not just a passage home, but a ship and fresh crew to carry him. There were 3 days of feasting in his honor, and during those days he told the story of his journey, but before he told it, he wept. A blind bard named Demodocus was singing at the feast, a court singer of great skill, someone who had learned the stories of the Trojan War and could render them in verse. And the story he chose to sing on the first evening was the famous quarrel between Odysseus and Achilles. The Phaeacians listened with pleasure, the way people listen to a story about famous events that happened to other people, Odysseus pulled his cloak up over his face so that his hosts would not see him weeping. He controlled it. He lowered the cloak when the song ended and poured a libation with steady hands. But Alcinous, sitting close enough to notice, had seen the edge of it, the particular set of a man's jaw, when he is not crying but is right at the border of crying, and he interrupted the bard and asked his guest, gently, who he was and where he was from, because clearly the song had touched him in a way that went beyond ordinary appreciation. And Odysseus told him. He told him his name, and there is a formality to it that the poem preserves beautifully, the way he states it as though establishing a claim, as though the name itself is a kind of property he has been defending the entire time he was traveling without it, as the unnamed beggar or the unnamed castaway of the man with no past that anyone around him could verify. His name was Odysseus of Ithaca, son of Laertes, known for his cleverness throughout the world. And then he said something that has been quoted for 3,000 years, that there is nothing sweeter to a person than their homeland, even if they live somewhere richer and more comfortable. Even a fine house in a foreign country is not home. He told it completely, starting with the Cicones and moving through the Lotus Eaters and Polyphemus and Aeolus and the Laestrygonians and Circe and the underworld and the Sirens and Scylla and Charybdis and the island of the sun and Calypso, all of it, in sequence, sitting in the great hall of the Phaeacians with firelight on the walls and his hosts listening with the particular quality of attention that good storytellers know how to produce, that deep quiet that descends on a room when the story is working. He did not rush it. He did not minimize it. He gave them every detail. The stone walls of the hall seemed to close in a little as he spoke, the way a room closes in when a story gets very good, when the space between the speaker and the listeners shrinks to almost nothing. They watched his face as he spoke, and his face moved the way faces move when a person is telling the truth from memory rather than arranging a narrative, with little uncontrolled expressions, with pauses in unexpected places, with moments where he looked at something nobody else in the room could see because it was 3 years ago or 6 years ago and on a different sea entirely. And the Phaeacians listened and wept in places, and at the end Alcinous said that they would give him anything he wanted, that any host who heard such a story owed its teller the deepest hospitality he could offer. They loaded a ship with gifts for him, bronze and gold and fine cloth, and in the deep middle of the night they carried him aboard, still asleep, wrapped in blankets, and laid him on the deck, and the Phaeacian ship set out for Ithaca. It was the kind of ship that needed no guidance, and it covered the distance while its passenger slept, and in the gray early light before dawn it slipped into a bay on the coast of Ithaca, and the crew carried Odysseus ashore still sleeping and laid him on the sand with the gifts beside him and sailed back to Scheria. When he woke, the ship was gone. He looked around and did not, at first, recognize where he was. This is one of the stranger and more poignant moments in the poem. After 20 years away, the man does not recognize his own island. Athena had wrapped the bay in mist so that Poseidon would not notice the landing. The god was still in a position to cause trouble, and the mist made everything look unfamiliar. He sat on the sand and wondered, genuinely, if he was on the right island. A young shepherd appeared and told him, when asked, that this was indeed Ithaca. The shepherd was Athena in disguise, which Odysseus figured out quickly. Or rather, the goddess dropped the disguise, smiling at him in the way she always smiled at him, with something that was affectionate and a little amused. She had a fondness for him that included a real appreciation for his particular kind of intelligence, and she showed it in how she played this encounter, leading him through the pretense, and then revealing herself and laughing slightly at how he had handled it. She told him the situation at home. His house was full of suitors, men from the islands and the local nobility who had been coming to his house for years, eating his food and drinking his wine and pressing his wife Penelope to choose one of them as a new husband, since Odysseus was presumed dead. There were over 100 of them at this point, the poem suggests, though the exact number varies. They were consuming his estate at a significant rate. His son Telemachus, who had been a baby when Odysseus left and was now a young man of approximately 20, was there but powerless, outnumbered, and without authority. Penelope had held them off for years with various strategies, the most famous being the shroud she had been weaving for her father-in-law Laertes, telling the suitors she would choose a husband when the shroud was finished, and then unraveling each night what she had woven during the day. The suitors had eventually discovered this trick and forced her to finish the shroud, but she had already bought years by it, and even now she was holding them off through sheer presence of will, refusing to commit, waiting. Athena disguised Odysseus as an old beggar. She aged his skin, shriveled his muscles, whitened his hair, put rags on him instead of the Phaeacian gifts, and hid the gifts in a cave. He looked old and poor and harmless. She told him to go to the farm of a swineherd named Eumaeus, who had been loyal to the household for 20 years, and wait there while Athena went to fetch Telemachus, who had gone searching for news of his father. The time Odysseus spent at Eumaeus's farm is one of the warmest sections of the poem. Eumaeus was a good man in the oldest and most straightforward sense of the word, honest, hard-working, loyal, kind to people who came to his door. He did not know the beggar he was hosting was his king. He only knew that an old man had arrived who needed food and shelter, and he provided it without hesitation, as the code of hospitality required, and he talked about his master Odysseus with genuine grief and affection. He missed him. He talked about him the way you talk about someone whose loss has become part of the shape of your days. He told the old beggar that his master had been a good man, and that he did not believe the reports that Odysseus was dead, though he could not say why he still believed it. Odysseus sat across the fire from the man who had raised his pigs for 20 years and listened to him praise Odysseus, and did not tell him who he was. He told Eumaeus that he was sure Odysseus was alive and would come home soon. He said this because it was true, and also because he could not say more without risking the entire plan. Telemachus arrived after a few days, having been guided home from his journey by Athena. He came to the farm first, knowing Eumaeus was reliable, and it was there that Odysseus revealed himself to his son. The moment is private and controlled. Athena instructed Odysseus to reveal himself, and he waited until Eumaeus had been sent away on an errand, and then he let the disguise fall. The transformation was instantaneous, a young man again, or closer to it, the beggar's rags replaced by the proper clothing Athena gave back to him. And Telemachus, who had never had a father in any real sense, who had grown up in a house full of men who were not his father eating his father's food, looked at this man and could not immediately believe it. They wept together. The two of them, father and son, wept in the farmhouse of the swineherd while the pigs moved outside in the pens, the sound of the farm going on around the extraordinary private moment inside. There was a lot of time to make up. There were 20 years of conversation and knowledge and experience that existed in the space between them that could not be covered in an afternoon, and they both knew it and did not pretend otherwise. What they covered instead was practical, what needed to happen, and when, and how. The suitors had to be dealt with. There were over 100 armed men eating in Odysseus' hall every night, and Odysseus and Telemachus were two. The plan was Odysseus, which should not surprise you. He would go to the palace as a beggar. Telemachus would go ahead and say nothing about his father's presence or plans. The weapons in the main hall, shields and spears and swords stored on the walls and on pegs around the room, as was the custom in a great house, would be quietly moved to a storeroom by Telemachus before the critical moment, leaving the suitors effectively unarmed. Two people would know who Odysseus was, an old coward named Philodeus and the swineherd Eumaeus. That was it. Everyone else in the house, including Penelope, would look at the old beggar and see only an old beggar. He went to the palace disguised, the walk into his own city, his own courtyard, his own hall, as a ragged old man whom no one recognized. This is one of the more quietly devastating parts of the story. He walked past the places that were his, and nobody looked at him twice. Nobody said welcome home. Nobody recognized the quality of his walk or the particular way he held his shoulders or the look in his eyes. He was invisible, which was the point, and it worked, and it was still a strange and heavy thing to bear. At the gate of the courtyard, lying in a pile of manure, was a dog, an old dog nearly blind, barely able to lift his head, Argos, who had been a puppy when Odysseus left for Troy, who had once been a brilliant hunting dog. 20 years had passed. The dog was ancient now, neglected, because the people who would have cared for him properly were no longer in charge of the house. When Odysseus came through the gate, the old dog lifted his head. He could not stand. He could not run. But his ears went up and his tail moved slowly once the last act of recognition available to him, and Odysseus, walking past him, looked away because he could not afford to let anyone see what was in his face in that moment. He made it past the gate. The dog let his head fall back down and he died. He had held on, the poem implies, for exactly as long as there was something to hold on for. Inside the hall, the suitors were feasting. They were loud in the way that people are loud when they have been comfortable and unchallenged for too long, when the habits of carelessness have settled in so deeply that they no longer think to question them. They threw scraps at the beggar. One of them, Antinous, the most aggressive of the group, threw a footstool at him. Penelope, upstairs, heard about it and was angry and sent for the old man to come to her. She wanted to speak to him, this beggar who had arrived with stories of her husband. Penelope, I want to give her the proper attention she deserves here, because she is one of the most remarkable figures in the entire poem, and she is often underwritten in modern retellings that focus on the adventure and the monsters and the divine interventions. Penelope had been holding a household together for 20 years. She had been doing it largely alone, with a young son who became a young man within those walls, and a staff of servants, some of whom were loyal and some of whom were not, and a house full of aggressive men who wanted her to choose one of them. She had done it with intelligence and patience, and a particular kind of stubborn faithfulness that is not the same thing as passivity. The distinction matters. Passivity is the absence of action. What Penelope was doing every single day required active work, active intelligence, active management of competing pressures from all sides. She was not passively waiting. She was holding a position. There is a difference. A person holding a position under sustained pressure makes decisions constantly, small ones and large ones, decisions about tone and timing and what to concede, and what to refuse, and how to play one interest against another to buy time, and when to seem to yield without actually yielding, and how to keep 100 calculating men all thinking that they still had a reasonable chance, so that none of them felt backed into a corner desperate enough to do something drastic. This is not a minor political skill. This is advanced political skill of the kind that usually comes with decades of training and authority, and Penelope had to figure it out on her own. In the middle of it, with no one above her to appeal to, and no guarantee that it was going to work. Every day she made decisions about how to handle the suitors, how to protect the estate, how to keep Telemachus safe, because Telemachus was also at risk in the way that the hair of a man presumed dead is always at risk from the people who would benefit from his removal. She was doing the work of a ruler without the title or the authority, sustained by a loyalty to an absent man that she was not even entirely certain deserved it anymore after 20 years. And yet she sustained it. That is what is extraordinary about her. Not that she waited, that would be ordinary and perhaps even naive, but that she waited without being passive, stayed faithful without being foolish, held the position without the position becoming a cage that defined her only in terms of someone else's absence. She had her own grief and her own life and her own intelligence running constantly beneath all of it, and the suitors never quite managed to see that clearly enough to outmaneuver it. She came downstairs to the hall, and the suitors immediately sat up straighter and smoothed their hair and tried to look their best, which is a detail the poem delivers almost casually, in a way that tells you exactly how her presence worked on them. She spoke to Antinous about throwing the footstool, and she was not gentle about it. Then she asked the old beggar to come to her chambers. They sat by the fire and they talked. Odysseus, still in his disguise, still the old beggar, told her a long, elaborate story about himself that was not entirely true, but was designed to give her hope. He told her that he had met Odysseus, that he had been entertained by the man in Crete years ago, that he knew for a fact Odysseus was alive and would be home soon. Penelope listened. The poem says she wept as he spoke, and he had to work at keeping his own composure, sitting there across the fire from his wife, whom he had not seen in 20 years, watching her cry for him while he lied to her about himself, because the plan required that she not know yet. It is one of the more complex emotional moments in the story, kindness and deception and love and strategy all folded into each other in a way that does not come apart cleanly. She told him about the shroud. She told him about the suitors and the pressure she was under. And then she told him about a dream she had had, 20 geese in the yard, eating grain, and an eagle coming down and killing them all, and then the eagle turning and telling her that he was Odysseus and the geese were the suitors. She believed the dream was true, but she was not sure. She felt the weight of it. Then she told the beggar what she had decided. In the morning, she was going to set a contest for the suitors. Odysseus's great bow, which she had kept locked in the storeroom, would be brought out, and the suitors would be asked to string it and shoot an arrow through 12 axe heads set in a row. Whoever could do it would be her new husband. This, she said, was going to be the end of it. She could not keep them off any longer. The old beggar, Odysseus, agreed that this was a good plan. He told her calmly that her husband would be home before any of the suitors could string that bow. She had the old woman Euryclea wash his feet that evening, a gesture of hospitality that was quite standard in a Greek household for an honored guest. Euryclea had been Odysseus's nurse since he was an infant. She was very old. And as she washed his feet by lamplight, her hands found a scar on his thigh, a specific scar from a boar hunt in his youth, a distinctive scar that she had known since it was first made. Her hand stopped. She looked up at his face. He caught her chin in his hand and looked her in the eyes and said, very quietly, "You must not speak of this. Do you understand?" And she looked at him for a long moment, and then she nodded, and she pressed his feet gently and did not say another word. The old woman had known him all his life, and she wept silently while she finished washing his feet, and he sat still and let her. The next morning came with the quality that mornings have before important things happen. Bright enough, the light coming in through the windows at the right angle, the sounds of the household starting the day, the smell of bread and fire, all of it exactly as it always was, and somehow more defined than usual, as though the day itself understood that this was different. Penelope brought the great bow out of the storeroom. She carried it herself, wrapped in a greased cloth, and set it in the hall. She carried the quiver of arrows, too. There were 12 arrows in it, smooth-shafted and bronze-tipped. The 12 axes were set in a row across the length of the hall, handles buried in the earth, the holes in the axe heads aligned in a perfect line. It was a remarkable shot, even if you could manage to string the bow, which was the first and more significant challenge. The bow itself. Let me spend a moment on the bow. It had been a gift to Odysseus from a man named Ithaca long ago, and it was a great bow in the old tradition, a composite bow made of layers of horn and wood and sinew, very stiff, designed for a man of specific strength and specific technique. It had been kept carefully for 20 years. The suitors were not weak men. They had been living in Odysseus' house for years, eating well, largely idle. But they were the sons of noble families, and they had grown up with weapons. They were not without strength. They could not string it. One by one they tried, going through the line by seniority or by confidence or by blind stubbornness, and one by one they failed. Some of them tried warming the bow near the fire to make it more flexible. It made no difference. The bow sat in their hands and would not bend far enough to loop the string into place. Each failure was accompanied by the specific kind of quiet that falls on a room when something expected is not happening, and the quiet accumulated until it had a weight of its own. In the meantime, Odysseus had slipped out and spoken to Eumaeus and Philodius, the swineherd and the coward, and shown them the scar, and they recognized it and wept briefly and then straightened up, because there was work to do. Philodius went and locked the courtyard gate from the inside. Eumaeus would pass the bow to Odysseus when the moment came. Telemachus sent his mother upstairs, gently but firmly, telling her that the bow was men's business today and she should go to her chambers. She went, surprised by the authority in his voice, which was new, and sat at her loom, and the heavy gate of sleep came over her there, Athena, giving her mercy, letting her miss what was about to happen. The suitors were still trying the bow when Odysseus, still in his beggar's rags, asked Antinous if he might try as well. Antinous refused immediately and with contempt. The others made jokes about the old man, thinking he could manage what they could not. It was Penelope who was still present in the hall at that point who said if he could string it, she would give him a new cloak and tunic and a sword. Not that she was going to marry a beggar, she said, but fairness required that anyone who wanted to try should be allowed. Telemachus then overruled everyone, including her, and sent her upstairs and told the suitors to hand the bow to the beggar. Eumaeus brought it across the hall, and some of the suitors grumbled loud enough for him to hear, and he was uncertain for a moment, and Odysseus nodded at him once, and Eumaeus put the bow in his hands and went and stood by the door. Odysseus turned the bow over in his hands. He checked every part of it carefully, unhurried, the way a craftsman checks a tool he has not used in a long time, checking for warping, for any change in the limbs, for the condition of the string he was about to use. The suitors watched and made comments. Some said he must be a dealer in bows to hold it so knowingly. Some said he must be planning to make himself a bow just like it. Nobody in that room, watching the old man turn the great bow over in his hands in the firelight, thought for a single moment that what was about to happen was about to happen. He strung it. He did it without visible effort. That is the detail that matters. Not with a grunt and a heave and a long moment of straining, but almost casually, the way you would string a bow you had owned for years and knew well. The string went on, and the bow vibrated with a sound that was clear and low and resonant, and several of the suitors looked at each other with the first real unease they had felt. He plucked the string once, a test note, and it rang out. He picked up one arrow. He did not stand. He sat exactly as he was, on his stool, and he sighted down the line of 12 axes and loosed the arrow, and it went through all 12 without touching a single blade. Then he looked at Telemachus, and Telemachus, who had been waiting for this moment for years, stepped aside from the door to the storeroom where the weapons were kept, the weapons that had been moved there quietly the evening before. There were no shields or spears left on the hall walls. Odysseus stood, and for the first time his voice in the hall was not the voice of an old beggar. He said, "You dogs, you thought I would never come home. You ate my food and pressed my wife and had no fear of the gods or of what men would say about you. You are at the end of it now." He had arrows and he had the bow, and his son stood at the door with a sword, and Eumaeus and Philoetius were at the other exits, and the suitors had nothing. Or rather, they had the weapons that were in the room with them. A few personal daggers, some desperate attempts to throw tables and grab anything that could serve as a shield. They tried to get to the storeroom. Telemachus held the door. They tried to argue, some of them trying very quickly to reframe what had been happening in the most favorable possible terms. Some of it had been Ance's fault. They said Antinous was the ringleader, the others had just been following him, some compensation could be arranged, this could all be settled. Antinous was dead by that point, the first arrow having found him while he was raising a cup of wine. What followed was, by any modern measure, extremely violent, and I am going to give it the calm, matter-of-fact treatment that the poem itself gives it, rather than dwelling on it. The suitors died, most of them trying to reach the door or the storeroom or a window. One Gothard managed to get some weapons from a back room and arm 12 of the suitors before Telemachus and Eumaeus caught him and dealt with him. Those 12 gave the fight a different quality for a short time, armed men in an enclosed space with a stone wall at their backs. But Athena was in the room by then, in one form or another, and the suitors died. When the last one was down, the great hall was quiet. The women servants who had been disloyal, who had been cooperating with the suitors, sleeping with them, helping them against the household, were brought to clean the hall before their own punishment. The hall was washed. The floors were scrubbed. The smoke from the burning of sulfur drove through every room, clearing whatever needed to be cleared. This is a detail that matters. The cleaning before the homecoming, the house being made proper before Penelope came down. She came down not knowing what had happened. Euryclea woke her. Penelope had been asleep through it all, Athena's gift of mercy, and told her with great excitement that Odysseus was here, that the guest she had spoken to the evening before was her husband, that he had killed all the suitors, and they were dead in the hall. Penelope's reaction is one of the most psychologically honest moments in the poem. She did not believe it. She rebuked the old woman gently, saying that the gods could make fools of the wisest minds, and that this was perhaps a dream or a delusion. She said that if one of the other gods, not Odysseus himself but some other divine being, had killed the suitors, it was possible that Odysseus was still far away and would never come home. She sat with the complexity of the moment, with the thing she had been longing for 20 years standing apparently right downstairs, and she held the complexity rather than dissolving into it, because 20 years of discipline does not dissolve in an instant, even for the thing you have been disciplining yourself toward. Penelope was not, at first, convinced. She came down the stairs and sat across the great hall from the man who had cleaned himself and put on proper clothing, and she looked at him and felt two things at once. an enormous pull toward believing it, and an equally enormous caution. She said calmly that if this was really Odysseus, he would know things about her that no one else could know. Telemachus lost his patience with her. There is a moment where the young man essentially tells his mother that she is being incredibly difficult, and why would she not simply go to the man? And she smiled at her son and told him gently that she and Odysseus had their own ways of understanding each other. She told the maids to make up the great bed in the bedroom and bring it out into the hall so her guests could sleep comfortably. It was a test. The bed could not be moved. Odysseus had built it himself years ago. Before the war, he had built the bedroom around a living olive tree that grew in that spot, and the bed was made from the trunk of that tree, the tree still rooted in the earth, the base of the bedpost still alive and in the ground, the room constructed around it. Nobody knew this except him and Penelope and one handmaid. It was the secret at the center of their marriage, the literal root of it. When she said the bed could be moved out into the hall, Odysseus' composure cracked for the first time. He said, "Who moved that bed? How could anyone move it? I made that bed from the living olive tree and built the room around it, and if someone has moved it, then they have cut the tree at its root, and I want to know who did it, and how." Penelope's composure cracked too. She ran to him. She put her arms around his neck and her face against his throat, and she wept, and he held her, and the poem says he wept too, and they held each other for a very long time while Athena, somewhere above them, held the night still and kept the sun from rising, giving them more hours of darkness than the world normally allowed, because they had more to cover than any ordinary night could hold. She said that she had always been afraid that a man might come and fool her with a story, that strangers come with lies and is not always possible to tell, that she had kept a part of herself apart, waiting for something only the right man could know, and now she knew. They sat up through the long night talking. He told her the outline of the journey, not every detail, not yet. There was time for that, but the shape of it, the 10 years gone, the places he had been, the men he had lost, the people who had helped him and the things that had tried to stop him. She listened with the quality of attention she had been building for 20 years, the same quality that kept her from making any irrevocable decision when everyone around her was urging her to, that had kept the door open through everything the world threw at it. She had kept the door open for him. That is what she had done for 20 years. She had kept the door open. "There is one more thing I promised to tell you," the last thing Tiresias said to Odysseus at the edge of the underworld. He said that after Odysseus dealt with the suitors and made peace at home, he would have to make one more journey. He would have to take an oar on his shoulder and walk inland, away from the sea, until he came to people who had never seen the sea and did not know what salt was and would not recognize the oar on his shoulder as an oar, but would mistake it for a winnowing fan used to thresh grain. There, he would plant the oar in the earth and make a sacrifice to Poseidon, and then he would go home and live out a long and peaceful life, and his death would come to him from the sea, gentle as anything, in his old age. It was a strange last instruction, this journey inland with an oar, this strange act of making peace with the god of the sea by planting an oar in a place where the sea was not even known. It suggests that the peace Odysseus needed to make was not just with Poseidon, but with the journey itself. With the sea, with the wandering, he had to walk it out of himself, carry it inland until the people who saw him did not even recognize what he had been carrying, and leave it there, planted in the earth. He had not done that yet on this night in Ithaca. On this night he was still in his own bedroom with his wife and the olive tree at the center of the bed, and outside the window the sky was beginning to lighten in the east, Athena finally releasing the night. The light came slowly. The kind of early light that has no color yet, just a pale arrival, a softening of the dark that says the day is coming. There is no stopping it, which is true every morning and is still every morning. A small surprise. The birds were beginning. One first, then two, then the chorus that builds from a single note to something that fills the entire sky. Odysseus was home. After 20 years, after Troy and the Cyclones and the Lotus Eaters and the dark cave of Polyphemus and the floating island of Aeolus and the horror of the Laestrygonians and the cool stone warmth of Circe's house and the gray edge of the world where the dead drift and speak and then go quiet, and the Sirens singing from their green island and the Narrows with their double horror and the breaking of the ship on the water after the cattle of Helios were eaten, and the long years on Calypso's island where the longing wore at him every day like the sea wears its stone. After all of it, he was here, in this room, with this woman, with the smell of the olive tree in the wood of the bed, and the sound of the birds starting outside and the gradual arrival of an ordinary Ithacan morning, which was the most extraordinary thing he had encountered in 20 years of extraordinary things. You know the feeling, or something like it, even if you have never been to sea. The feeling of being in a place so familiar that your body knows it without your mind having to do any work. Particular quality of the air in the room you have slept in for years. The way the light hits the wall at certain times of day. The feel of the floor under your feet in the dark, when you know exactly where everything is and do not need to look. Home is that knowledge. It is the place your body carries even when your mind is far away. And Odysseus had carried Ithaca in his body for 20 years. Through every storm and every strange shore and every beautiful island that was not his island and every comfortable captivity and every near death. And now the carrying was over and the arriving was done and the morning was coming up. Outside the window and he was home. There is a question that the reunion scene poses quietly, without answering it directly, and I want to sit with it for a moment before we move to the very end of the story. The question is this: after 20 years apart, after everything each of them has been through separately and in their own way, are these still the same two people who parted on a beach in Ithaca when the fleet was leaving for Troy? Odysseus had been through the full list of what we have talked about tonight. Penelope had been through 20 years of a different kind of difficulty, the grinding daily difficulty of holding on, of maintaining dignity and strategy under sustained pressure, of raising a son into a man in a house that did not respect her properly, of making decisions alone year after year, with no one to consult and no one to share the weight of them. Both of them had been changed by what happened to them while they were apart. Both of them were different from the people they remembered. And yet they had both been held in place in some essential way by their idea of each other. Odysseus had refused immortality to come back to a woman who was, by the time he returned, a woman he had not seen for 20 years and whom he really knew only from before the war, from the early years of a marriage that had not yet been tested by time or distance. Penelope had held off 100 suitors and worn out her youth doing it for a man who was, in her mind, also 20 years younger than he was by the time he walked back through her door. They had been faithful to an idea of each other as much as to the actual people, and the question of whether the idea and the person can survive the gap between them, that is not a question the poem entirely resolves. What it does instead is give us the bed, the olive tree, the secret that proves they are who they say they are. Not a declaration of perfect reunion and an effortless reconnection, but a specific, rooted, particular truth that only the two of them share, that belongs to the original people inside the changed people, the couple who built a bedroom around a living tree and decided together that this was their home, and their secret and theirs alone. That is enough. It does not need to be more than that. The olive tree is still rooted in the earth, and the bed is still the bed, and they are home. The story of the Odyssey does not quite end there. There is a reconciliation that still has to happen, with Laertes, his father, still alive on the small farm outside the city, still grieving, still wearing the rough clothes of a laboring man, rather than the clothes of a king's father, because he had put off anything fine or soft when his son went away and had never put them back on. Odysseus went to the farm the next morning, and he found the old man alone in his orchard, working the earth around the base of a fig tree with a hoe, his head down, his back bent, the work of his hands, the thing that was holding him together. Odysseus tested him gently at first, watching him without revealing himself, and then he could not hold it. The old man's grief was too present and too real, and he told him who he was. Laertes looked at his son, and then he had to grab a fence post to keep from falling. And then Odysseus held him up, and they stood in the orchard together, and the old man put his hands on his son's face and looked at him for a long time, the way you look at someone you thought was gone, and who has come back to you against all reasonable expectation. There was one more piece of trouble: the families of the dead suitors, who had their own grief and their own anger and came looking for justice, or at least revenge. But Athena resolved that too, appearing in her own form in the end and telling everyone to stop, declaring the feud finished, making it so. The goddess had protected this man across 20 years and an ocean and all of it, and she was not going to let it end in a new cycle of blood. She stepped into the moment with her full authority, and the fighting stopped and the peace held. And so it ended, not with a great ceremony or a formal declaration, but with the ordinary settling back into life that follows any long absence, the adjustments and the relearnings and the slow return to routine, Penelope at her loom, but weaving now rather than unraveling. Telemachus with the authority of a young man who has had to become himself in difficult circumstances and has done it well. Laertes in his orchard, or not quite. Athena restored his vigor too as a sort of final gift, and the old man stood up straighter, the household finding its shape again. And Odysseus in the evenings, sitting by a fire in his own hall, in his own kingdom, on his rocky island that was not large or particularly rich and had thin soil for farming and the sea all around it, sitting there with the particular peace of a man who knows what he has and knows what it costs to keep it. Not perfect peace, not the peace of someone who has not suffered or lost, the more complicated peace of someone who has suffered and lost and has come back anyway, who has stood at the very edge of the world and looked into the dark where the dead go and has turned back toward the light, who has tied himself to a mast and heard the most beautiful sound imaginable and not gone to it, who has held the door of his own home open in his mind for 20 years and finally come through it. I want to tell you one more thing before we let this story go for the night. The Odyssey exists as a poem because stories need to be told. Not because they are instructive necessarily, not because they teach a lesson that can be easily stated, but because they are the way human beings make sense of things that otherwise refuse to be made sense of. The ancient Greeks had other ways of understanding the world: philosophy, mathematics, architecture, medicine, and they were remarkably good at all of them. But the stories came first and stayed longest. The Odyssey was being told aloud in performance before it was ever written down, and it was being written down before most of the other things the ancient Greeks are famous for were even beginning. It sat at the root of their culture the way the olive tree sat at the root of the bed in that bedroom in Ithaca, the thing everything else was built around, the living center that stayed even as the world changed around it. What the Odyssey understands, and what the ancient Greeks understood through it, is that a journey is not really a story about the places you go. It is a story about what the going costs you and what you find out about yourself in the course of paying that cost. Every monster and god and beautiful island in this story is also an inner state. The lotus eaters are the seduction of forgetting. The Cyclops is the danger of hubris, of thinking you are too clever to be in real danger, of calling out your name when you should be silent. The Sirens are the appeal of knowledge purchased at the cost of everything else you care about. Circe's island and Calypso's island are the particular traps of comfort and beauty that can hold you long enough to make you forget you had somewhere to be. The cattle of the sun are the test of keeping faith with a promise when keeping faith costs you everything, and the terrible, human fact that people fail such tests, not because they are bad, because they are hungry and desperate, and the gap between what they know they should do and what the body demands eventually closes in a bad direction. And the journey home, the long last section, the disguise, the patience, the waiting, the timing, is the test of whether you have learned anything from all of it. Whether you can apply everything the sea taught you, all those years of reading the weather wrong and reading it right, all those encounters with things larger and more powerful than yourself that you survive by being careful and thoughtful to the most important situation of your life. Whether you can see your own house from the outside with a clear eye and understand what it needs and what you need to do and do it steadily, without flinching, even when it is very hard. The ancient Greeks told this story because they knew something that we still know 3,000 years later, even if we have different names for it. That the pull of home is one of the most powerful forces in a human life, that a person can endure extraordinary things in its service. That there is something in us, something specifically and stubbornly human, that refuses to stop looking toward the place and the people we belong to, even when every reasonable calculation says we should give up and settle for something easier. Odysseus could have stayed with Calypso and been immortal and never suffered again. He chose the uncertain road back to his mortal life, his aging wife, his rocky island, his old dog waiting in the courtyard. He always knew where home was, even when he could not see it, even when the sea stretched blank and enormous in every direction and no land was visible anywhere and Poseidon was in a bad mood and the stars were behind clouds. He always knew. He kept the great bear on his left. He kept going. And that, dear friend, is the Odyssey, the complete journey of Odysseus from the ruins of Troy to the orchards of Ithaca, told to you on a quiet night, as the world outside goes darker and softer, and the sounds of the day give way to the sounds of sleep. 3,000 years ago, people sat around fires and told this story and felt what you might be feeling now, somewhere in the soft space between waking and sleep, that particular ache of home, that particular gratitude for the warmth you are lying in right now, for the ceiling above you and the familiar sounds of the place you live, for the people who know your name and will be there when morning comes. Let the Odyssey carry you the rest of the way tonight. Let the sound of the Aegean in your mind be the sound that takes you under, slow and rhythmic and ancient and not unkind. Let Ithaca, green and rocky and small, be the last image behind your eyes. Let Odysseus be home. He earned it. He always was going to get there. Good night from History After Midnight. Sleep well wherever you are.